Welcome to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen, your go-to show for all things Broncos.
What's good, Broncos country? Welcome in to the Huddle Up Podcast presented by Mile High Huddle. It's time to drop some knowledge. I'm your host today, Chad Jensen, Scout Media, CBS Sports Digital. I'm rolling solo today, but I wanted to address a very pressing, very interesting issue that popped up on Thursday. First, though, understand, Huddle Up is not here to just report the news. We're here to give you a deep dive on your favorite team, the Denver Broncos, whether it's myself, Nick and Carl, Luke, Eric, whoever it is. We're here to give you a deep dive, and we need your help. Take a second and rate the show on iTunes, or if you're on Android, rate the show on Stitcher. And if you have time, we'd appreciate it if you take a second and leave a comment. Two very important things that can really help us grow the show. Make sure you're following Huddle Up on Twitter at HuddleUp_MHH. If you appreciate what we're doing here, retweet the episodes on Twitter and share them on Facebook. Now, this is a MileHighHuddle.com podcast, and Mile High Huddle, of course, is part of Scout.com and the CBS Sports Digital Network. Now, one thing that sets Mile High Huddle apart is our premium membership offering. We save our best, most in-depth Broncos content for our premium members. We're all about diving deep for the Broncoholics out there in our written analysis, just like this show. Now, a premium membership costs $5 per month, but we give back to you for supporting us. Our premium members get 10% off on tickets through Ticketmonster and 10% off on Broncos team merchandise through Fanatics. The benefits are legit, and you won't miss a single piece of our Broncos analysis, so check that out. Now, I'm sure most of you are already subscribing to Huddle Up on iTunes and Stitcher for Android, but if you're not, take care of that. The show can also be found on Spreaker, SoundCloud, iHeart, CastBox, pretty much anywhere you need it to be. Now, this is considered to be the dead time on the NFL calendar, but with OTAs, Phase 3 of OTAs coming up next week, training camps on the horizon, we're going to be working furiously to bring you consistent content, and you're not going to want to miss a single episode. Now, as we get further into the summer, the Broncos quarterback competition it's going to grow into a bigger and bigger storyline nationally. Now, you look at the Broncos roster, it is stacked across the board, and really, the only missing clarity is at one position, and it's the most important position of them all, quarterback, right? The Broncos believe, and I agree with them, that they're basically one quarterback away from contending for world championships once again. Now, we've heard the saying that, if you have two quarterbacks, you have none. And although that is a cliche, there is some truth to it. That's why these sayings become cliche, because there's truth. Speaking of truth, that's the Broncos' mantra this year. It's all over the building at Dove Valley, similar to how iron sharpens iron was plastered everywhere in 2015. This time, Vance Joseph's message is truth. Now, the Broncos quarterback situation, believe it or not, it might not be ideal, but it is envied by some teams around the league. Denver might not have, a bona fide Pro Bowler at the position, or clarity, or someone they can consider to be the man at quarterback. But they do have two viable options, two young guys who have the potential to grow into that caliber of player. Now, the Broncos, you look at the 2016 Broncos and where they're at today in 2017, they're just a few months out from sending 6 players to the Pro Bowl, despite finishing 9-7 and missing the playoffs. Now, this team, in other words, is stacked. And in Denver, the expectations, they're always high, and they're high now. Of course, that hasn't changed. The Broncos, in fact, could have sent more guys to the Pro Bowl, at least one, because Trevor Siemian was voted as an alternate, had the opportunity to accept an invitation after some guys ahead of him bowed out, but he had to decline because of his shoulder surgery. So you think about that performance that Trevor Siemian turned in last year. He had guys around the league, coaches, and I guess some fans as well, that perceived that to be a Pro Bowl caliber performance. Think about that what you will. But as Paxton, Lynch, and Trevor Siemian, they're about to square off against one another once again, this storyline the Broncos quarterback competition will not only captivate Denver and the Rocky Mountain region, but the nation too. And speaking of the national angle, Albert Breer of the MMQB, part of SISportsillustrated.com, recently sat down with Denver's first-year head coach Vance Joseph, and the topic revolved around the Broncos quarterback situation. Today, I'm going to break down some of these Joseph quotes, try and make sense of what he revealed to Breer, and we'll kind of go through them in chronological order. Now, here's the first thing he said that really caught my eye. Quote, I told the entire team from this moment on, everyone gets a clean slate, and that includes the quarterbacks. So how they play from this moment on is what I'm concerned about, not last year or college. I'm concerned about this moment moving forward, who the best guy is for our football team. Closed quote. So Joseph there, obviously, he's alluding to the fact that, look, there's a new sheriff in town. This is a new regime. This is a fresh set of eyes analyzing the Broncos roster. Nobody's here on scholarship, right? Everybody has to earn their keep, and nothing is guaranteed. Now, he talks a lot, and he has ever since he was hired, about competition and there being open competition across the board. Well, we know that's not entirely true, right? We know, for example, that if he's healthy, Matt Paradis, there's no competition for center, right? Broncos are paying $9 million a year to the recently signed Ron Leary to play left guard. There's no competition at that spot, right? Von Miller, Shane Ray, no competition as for the starting outside linebacker gigs. I mean, Shaq Barrett could always push Shane Ray, but he's going to be the starter, Ray. Cornerback, there's going to be no competition for Aqib Talib and Chris Harris Jr. Now, Bradley Roby, he's still going to be that third corner. He's still going to be playing starter snaps. But those two guys ahead of him, those two all-pros, they're as entrenched as you can get. At safety, yeah, I can see a little competition. I mean, you got two guys who have both been to the Pro Bowl in Darian Stewart and TJ Ward, but there's a couple of young guys behind him, Justin Simmons, Will Parks. I mean, the Broncos signed like 6 safeties in the college free agent ranks after the draft. So there's a young contingent, a youth movement, if you will. The Broncos do want to see some competition there because TJ Ward's getting old, and so is Darian Stewart. But both those guys, at least for this year, are also pretty entrenched. The quarterback position, well, before we even get there, receiver. No one's going to supplant Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders. I mean, just look at their accomplishments, A, the quality and caliber of players they are, B, and then the amount of money they're making. I mean, the Broncos, you can, playing time and salary, those two things usually correspond too, right? So, yes, Carlos Henderson's going to come in and be that third receiver, but he's not about to beat either one of those guys out of a job this year. And by the way, running back's going to be a phenomenal competition, especially if Jamal Charles ends up being able to turn the corner and that knee holds up. That is going to be a phenomenal competition to watch. And even if he doesn't, you've got Devontae Booker knocking on the door in his second year, going back to the power scheme in which he thrived in college. And then you've got this young D'Angelo Henderson coming in, a 6th-round pick, who is a lot of people are sleeping on, but a phenomenally talented young player who really seems all ready to get it. So that's going to be a great competition, pushing C.J. Anderson and Jamal Charles if he ends up, actually being healthy enough to contribute. But the quarterback position, open competition. And you can, on the surface, you can say, yeah, it's going to be an open competition. But is it really? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that specific topic. Is it really an open competition here in just a minute? But yeah, I mean, let's focus, in fact, on the quarterback situation. I mean, Paxton Lynch had a very productive final year in college at Memphis as a junior. Trevor Siemian had some solid tape at times. Specifically, I guess, the one game that the Broncos were really impressed by, speaking specifically of Gary Kubiak, was the game against Notre Dame, Northwestern versus Notre Dame. But he didn't, as a guy who split playing time with another quarterback for most of his collegiate career, Siemian didn't have a ton of tape, not a lot of collegiate laurels to rest on, if you will. So these guys, both of them, I mean, one's a first-round pick, one's a former 7th-round pick and all that, but all things being equal, I mean, neither of these guys were winning national championships. None of these guys were Heisman. Neither, I should say. These guys were Heisman winners. So it doesn't matter, in other words, what you did in college. And listening to Joseph there, it doesn't matter what these guys did last year. Now, getting back to Joseph, this guy was a hot coaching name during the 2015 offseason, if you guys remember. Back when Gary Kubiak, the Broncos, had parted ways with John Fox. Gary Kubiak, they were courting him. Vance Joseph, they wanted him to come in and be the defensive coordinator, but Cincinnati wouldn't let him leave. And so he had to stay on in Cincy one more year. And then when he became free, took the defensive coordinator job with the Miami Dolphins in 2016. And that's where his star really took on an even brighter sheen. Now, the Dolphins, they came out of nowhere in 2016 under the new head coach, Adam Gase. They won a wild card spot. They advanced in the playoffs. It's been a long time since that organization had been to the postseason. And it wasn't an easy path for them. They made some tough decisions early on in the season, like cutting 3 starting offensive linemen, including guard Billy Turner, whom the Broncos claimed on waivers as still a Bronco. At one point, Vance Joseph benched their superstar, the edge rusher, the defensive end, Mario Williams, just to set a precedent and send the right message to his players. And that message, I mean, if you look at the results, was received loud and clear. Miami ended up having a great season, by their standards, even though the defense, honestly, kind of struggled under Vance Joseph. I mean, they had their moments, but they weren't a dominant unit. But here's what Joseph attributed to Miami's turnaround. I'm going to read this quote because I think it applies to how he's approaching the Broncos. Quote, "The biggest thing we did as far as culture change," he's speaking about the Dolphins, "was making it an environment where the players loved to come to work. We didn't have a bad day last year." Closed quote. Now, this speaks to Joseph's, not only what happened in Miami last year, but really the type of head coach that he is. And building the right culture is really what it comes down to for Joseph. What attracted John Elway and the Broncos organization to Vance Joseph? Well, it's his charisma, his ability to be a leader of men. You've heard that before. The Broncos last year, they suffered from that Super Bowl hangover. They suffered from a lack of leadership. And then they suffered from the frustration of not winning consistently like they had become accustomed to as an organization. And down the stretch, when the threads were coming undone, you saw that rift begin to take shape in the locker room that really culminated in that Week 15 after the Broncos lost to the Patriots. And that was really the death knell on the season, to be honest. There was that spat in the locker room that was covered by Michael Silver of NFL.com between Aqib Talib and, of course, Russell Okung. And we don't need to get into that, but there was a rift, and a lot of it had to do with the leadership void left by Peyton Manning. DeMarcus Ware wasn't as engaged because of his injury situation last year. And just overall, the Broncos were trying to figure out how to roll with the punches, and it kind of came apart. And the coaching staff, Gary Kubiak was going through health issues. There was changes. There was frustration about not producing on offense, and the whole thing just kind of went sideways. So in comes this Vance Joseph. The Broncos want Joseph. They hire him, and it's all about rebuilding the culture in the Denver Broncos locker room. It's about truth. It's about facing uncomfortable truths, whether it's players doing self-scouting, self-analyzing, communication, accountability, truth. And I think that's really actually when you talk about a team mantra or a team catchphrase or a saying or whatever, I think truth is actually very interesting and a cool mantra to hang your hat on, because that's really what it takes as a professional. These guys have to be honest with each other. They have to be honest with themselves. They have to come to work every day and strive to be the best and to be pros. And there's truth in that. And it really intrigues me that that's what Vance Joseph and his staff kind of settled on as the rallying cry for 2017. Now, Vance Joseph, here's something interesting, came out of his comments with Albert Breer. He's implementing a scoreboard or a grading system, if you will, with the Broncos. It's all designed to keep the defense dominant and to challenge the offense to rise up from being the little baby brother, the baggage weighing down the team, to becoming a prominent factor into winning. Here's what Joseph said, quote, "There's going to be a scoreboard on everything. It's going to be a grading system on everything, from how many loafs to how many missed tackles, to how many turnovers we can force, to how many touchdowns we throw for or run in. It's going to be a grading system on every drill we do. We want our offense to develop a confidence and a swagger that says they can go out and play with anyone. And defensively, we want to continue our culture of playing dominant defense. I think competition, that's going to be the first thing that's different with OTAs starting Tuesday for the players, closed quote. Now, you go back to pretty much any time John Elway spoke publicly leading up to free agency and leading up to the draft. He talked about how, and iterated time after time, how the defense is the core and the strength of the team. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out, right? Let's face it. But what he means is, he would get asked questions about, would you want to trade an Aqib Talib to acquire this offensive skill position, or, these type of questions that get fielded and these type of topics that come up in the media. He is managing this team from its position of strength, which is defense. Okay, that's where the bread is buttered, obviously. But in order for this team to take the next step and get back into the conversation of contending in the AFC, they have to be balanced. And in order for them to do that, the offense has to be able to carry their own water. Now, going back to last year, obviously all the changes as we just talked about, but you had a second-year player and a first-time starting quarterback in Trevor Siemian and an offensive line in shambles, a non-existent running game, and the offense just never was able to consistently produce, leading the league in 3 and outs, failing to run the ball effectively, failing to score, and it put the onus on the defense. And, the Broncos as a team, they were able to bear that weight through the first part of the season. But down the stretch, again, when the war of attrition that is the 16-game NFL season begins to take its toll, the defense started to show cracks. There was cracks in the veneer. They ended up finishing 28th against the rush after finishing 3rd in 2015 when they won the Super Bowl. They still finished as the number 1 passing defense for the second season in a row. But in the NFL, you got to be able to stop the run and run the ball, and the Denver Broncos could do neither. And a lot of that had to do with the defense. Yeah, there were personnel changes, losing Malik Jackson, and there were some injuries and things like that, and Danny Trevathan. But really what it came down to is the Broncos were on the field, the defense, too much. Too much of the burden was put on them. The offense couldn't stay on the field, and that just put the onus on the defense. Now this year, every step it seems in terms of the Vance Joseph hire, all the way to Mike McCoy, all the way to Bill Musgrave, all the way to Jeff Davidson. All of these hires have been made in order to shape this offense into something, as Joseph talks about there, that can have some swag. They're looking to develop the confidence and swagger that, as he says, quote, can go out and play with anyone. And they're going to get the opportunity through OTAs, training camp, to go against the best. They're going to get to sharpen that razor against the very best in the league in the Broncos defense in practice each and every day. And that's, I think, how it's going to bear some fruit. But it starts with the coaching. It starts with the scheme. We talk about tailoring everything to the strengths of the players instead of trying to force feed a system on players who don't fit it, as we saw in the last couple of seasons with Gary Kubiak at the helm. So all that's exciting, but it is interesting. You think about everything being graded from, how many turnovers to the touchdowns to everything's going to be graded all the way down to each and every drill. It's going to be interesting to see how that takes shape this summer in training camp. Now, I'm going to get to what Joseph had to say about the quarterbacks, which is some of the most compelling aspects to his conversation with Albert Breer. But first, Huddle Up is accepting new sponsors. We are looking for a new sponsor. And one thing you need to understand is, according to a study from the Interactive Advertising Bureau and Edison Research, consumers are highly likely to purchase from podcast sponsors. According to a survey of 1,000 podcast listeners, nearly 2/3, 65% of them, were more willing to consider purchasing products and services they learned about during a podcast. 60% added that given equal price and quality, they prefer to purchase from companies that advertise on their favorite podcasts. So if you're listening to this show as a business owner, you have a product, you have a service you want to get out there, that's some powerful data. And if you'd like to reach the male demographic in particular, your company should be sponsoring this podcast. Feel free to reach out to us at milehighhuddle@gmail.com and we can talk about it. Now, we get to the quarterback talk, starting with Trevor Siemian. Here's what Joseph had to say. And honestly, it's nothing new, but we're going to get to why we're even talking about this. He said, quote, Siemian's game is a game of patience. It's a game of confidence. He is in control. He's a smart guy. He throws the ball where it should go most of the time. He's got a high football IQ, closed quote. Conversely, here's what he said about Paxton Lynch. Quote, the physical ability is there. He's a first-round pick, great height, great arm talent, great mobility, closed quote. Now, none of this, what he said just there about Lynch and Siemian, is breaking any new ground, right? I mean, pretty much any time Vance Joseph has spoken publicly about the quarterbacks, he's landed on these same type of things. You know, with Paxton Lynch, it's always, height, athleticism, mobility. With Siemian, it's always talking about, his composure and his football IQ and all that. But I want to bring your attention to something that Joseph said when describing Lynch. And honestly, almost every time he talks about Lynch, this is another thing he brings up. 3 words, first round pick. Now, ask yourself, why would he say that? Why would Vance Joseph say first round pick when talking about Paxton Lynch and the strengths and what type of quarterback he is? But then on the other hand, not say, when he's talking about Trevor Siemian, anything about him being a former 7th round pick. Now, if this is a clean slate, if this is an open competition for all players, what does draft pedigree have to do with anything? I'll tell you. In fact, I think Joseph is dropping some breadcrumbs here. The Broncos are in a spot, frankly, here's how it is. They're in a spot with regard to Paxton Lynch where they almost have to play him. Because if Trevor Siemian wins the job again in 2017, that would make it 2 years in a row. Then when would Lynch ever see the field in Denver, notwithstanding an injury to Siemian? Think about it. After 2 years of winning the quarterback battle and starting, not only would Siemian be light years ahead of Lynch in his development, he'd become even more entrenched in the hearts and minds of his teammates. It would almost eliminate Lynch from ever seeing the field as a starting quarterback in the orange and blue unless catastrophe struck, like in the case of Brock Osweiler in 2015, right? But we all know how that story ended. Now back to the first round pick thing. Again, why say that at all? When talking about Garrett Bowles, Joseph said he was a first round pick for a reason. In other words, Bowles was drafted in the first round to play. He was drafted in the first round to start, the same as all first-round picks. And Paxton Lynch is no different. With Lynch, the Broncos can afford to roll the dice and start him in 2017 because they'll still have control of Siemian through 17 and all the way through 2018. Now, if things go sideways with Lynch as the starter at any point, they can always turn back to their trusty Trevor Siemian. Now, if Siemian starts in 2017, if he wins the job, quote-unquote, we kind of know what we're going to get. Now, he could always improve. Okay, I'm not saying the book is out on Siemian, although there are a lot of people that I've talked to who believe that. He could always improve. You never know. But in all likelihood, just speaking of 2017 in particular, he's probably going to play just well enough to keep the starting job, but not quite well enough to get the Broncos over the hump. Lynch won't see the field if Siemian wins the job, barring injury, right? But here's the thing. First-round picks have to play, y'all. The Broncos understand that bitter truth more than anyone. They're the ones investing the draft capital. They know what kind of return they have to get. Paxton Lynch, for better or for worse, has to play in 2017. Now, they're not going to come outright and say that, obviously, and there are a lot of reasons why. But the truth is this. The Broncos are never truly going to know what they have in Paxton Lynch until they play him. He's got to go through the trial and error process, the bumps in the road, the trial by fire. It's the most proven way to develop first-round quarterbacks. Does it work every time? Obviously not. For every Jameis Winston, there's a Jamarcus Russell. For every Andrew Luck, there's a Robert Griffin III. But whether it turns out well or badly for the player, at least the team knows what they have in that player because they put him out on the field. Washington, for example, by playing RG3, found out in a short matter of a couple of seasons that he wasn't what they expected him to be when they drafted him. And because they played him, it ended up bringing them all the much closer to the Kirk Cousins resolution, right? And the same goes for the Broncos. You don't think the coaches know this? I mean, Paxton Lynch is going to be afforded every opportunity to be the starter this year, and unless he totally falls flat on his face, he's going to be the starter. And I've received a few questions about this on Twitter after I posted a story talking about just kind of some rapid reaction to what Vance Joseph had to say to the MMQB piece on milehighhuddle.com. A few questions asking me about Lynch and Siemian, this and that. Now you know. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with regard to Vance Joseph's piece here with Albert Breer is what he had to say about the traits he's looking for in the quarterbacks that are going to determine who wins the starting job. He said, quote, "I'd say decision-making is going to be a major factor in who wins the job. That's the position in the NFL, the guy who makes great decisions with the football, not turning the ball over, and the guy who lets his teammates play for him. That's the guy I want to lead our football team. Obviously, ball placement in the pass game, the ability to get us into the best play, those things are important. But it comes down to decision-making. That's the biggest factor in this decision I'm going to make," closed quote. Now, you look at that quote, and what jumps out, obviously, is the whole decision-making thing. But built within his remarks there is also, he talks about a guy who lets his teammates play for him. Okay? He's talking about leadership qualities. He's talking about quarterbacks who guys want to follow. And honestly, as it stands on paper right now, that's the type of persona Trevor Siemian has in the Broncos locker room. So, in other words, in order for that to change, Paxton Lynch is going to have to wrest it away, that faith and that belief that the guys have in Siemian. He's going to have to try and wrest that away from Trevor Siemian by his performance, not only on the field, but how he conducts himself in the locker room, in the meeting rooms. But going back to the decision-making thing, don't assume that Trevor Siemian has the advantage. I've already heard that a few times today. Oh, if it's all about decision-making, throw Lynch out because Siemian's the cerebral one. He's the smart guy. He's the Northwestern guy. Lynch, he's the big goofball who couldn't figure out Kubiak's system as a rookie. So if it's all about decision-making, Trevor Siemian's the guy. Let's read between the lines here. I couldn't disagree more, okay? You look at Trevor Siemian as a player, and yes, he's a smart guy. He's a savvy guy. I've said it many times that for all his shortcomings in 2016, he really did, in my mind, exceed the expectations I had for him, okay? He did a lot of things that impressed the hell out of me. And the biggest thing, though, that really bothered me about Trevor Siemian, and it's in part and parcel to the Broncos' struggles on third down, was his decision-making on third down. How many times, think about this, go back in time in your mind to the 2016 season, how many times did you see a play where it's 3rd and 7, Trevor Siemian takes the snap and either checks it down or hits a tight end on a 3-4 yard curl route crossing or crossing pattern, hits him, boom, the guy gets tackled short of the sticks, Broncos have to punt, right? That was a constant. That's one of the reasons they led the league in 3 and outs. You don't think that has to do with decision making? At some point, it didn't take long. It took about halfway through the season, teams started figuring it out, but pretty soon, that's how teams played Trevor Siemian. They were A-okay with giving him the underneath lanes. They were totally fine with that. They dared him to beat them deep. But they knew he wasn't going to do it. They knew that if the route was open short or underneath, he was going to take that dump off and hope that the receiver could break a tackle and turn the ball upfield and pick up some positive yards. So as a defense, they knew what to expect on a down-in and down-out basis, especially in passing situations, and they planned accordingly. They dropped back, a little bit of zone, let the patterns develop underneath, wait for him to make that throw, just read his eyes, and then they would swarm up on the ball and tackle the guy a couple yards short of the first down marker, punt. Now, you can chalk that kind of thing up to they're still learning the ropes, they're still building their confidence, but Siemian had the scope of an entire season to get over that hump, and he never could, okay? So Paxton Lynch, I mean, he wasn't some star as a rookie. Wasn't exactly a shining example of the guy challenging the defense vertically all the time, but I'm just saying, when you talk about that aspect of what Joseph's looking for in a quarterback and who wins the starting job, decision-making, don't automatically assume that means that gives Trevor Siemian the advantage, because Paxton Lynch has earned some praise so far this offseason. First of all, during the offseason, he was working with a quarterback's coach, Charlie Taff, in Florida, working on his game, working on his technique, and as soon as he returned to Dove Valley to commence the offseason training program, didn't take long for buzz to get out there that he's a different person. He's like almost like a different quarterback. He's a lot more confident. He already has an impressive knowledge of the playbook, and that's going to lead into leadership. The leadership conversation. And Vance Joseph challenged Paxton Lynch publicly. I believe it was in his remarks at the NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis a couple months ago, back in February. But when talking about Paxton Lynch, Vance Joseph did say that it's not just about performance, that it has leadership obligations as well. And people follow the guys who produce. People follow the guys who know what they're talking about, right? And Lynch has already taken the right steps down that path with the work he's put in thus far. Now, does that mean it's going to translate to performance on the field? Not necessarily. We don't know that. But it's a gigantic leap in the right direction for a guy who, as a rookie, was just completely overwhelmed, starstruck at times by different players, not only in his own locker room, but other teams, overwhelmed by the playbook. I mean, overwhelmed by the changes in technique, overwhelmed in the speed of the game. I mean, you name it. The whole aspect of making the jump to the pros for Paxton Lynch was so enormous. The gap was so large that he didn't have a chance to try and be a leader. He was playing catch-up on a day-to-day basis. But now that he's had that year of being in the NFL under his belt, things are starting to slow down. He's entering a system under a coaching staff who are committed to tailoring things to fit him. Not just him, but Siemian too. They're going to be playing to these guys' strengths. I mean, it's all going to be for the benefit of these two young quarterbacks, and that'll trickle down to the entire offense. So it's really interesting. Some of the things that, I mean, a lot of what Joseph had to say in the Breer piece was definitely not treading any new ground, but he did say a few things that were very interesting. And again, I want you to think about, as we close the show here, I want you to think about why Vance Joseph continues to bring up the fact that Paxton Lynch was a first-round pick every time he talks about him publicly. Why do you think he has to go to that length? It's because it matters. The Broncos know that it's 2017 or bust for Paxton Lynch. And you can argue with me on it, and it's fair to argue. I can understand anyone who disagrees with me, that side of the fence. Feel free to come at me on Twitter. We can talk about it, or the Mile High Huddle message boards, or whatever. And I'm happy to explain maybe a little bit more in detail my thinking on the topic. But yeah, I don't think that as long as Paxton Lynch, as long as it's even remotely close, Paxton Lynch is going to be the starting quarterback of the Denver Broncos in 2017, for better or for worse. And if it is for worse, if the Broncos get through half the season and there's just no hope on the horizon with Paxton Lynch under center, they still have the trusty Trevor Siemian, and they have him under contract through 2018. And really, they can control him even farther beyond that, depending on how they want to use different transition tags. But that's how I see it. Nonetheless, Vance Joseph remarks, an interesting piece with Albert Breer. And again, this is a storyline that's obviously consuming the local conversation, but it's going to take on an even larger life in the national media as we get into training camp and then the preseason. And it's going to be a lot of fun to cover, and we're going to be there every step of the way. So thanks for staying with us. It's all the time we have for today's episode of Huddle Up. Again, be sure to follow the show on Twitter at HuddleUp_MHH. You can find me in the Twitterverse at Chad N. Jensen and at Mile High Huddle. Love hearing from you. Hit me up. Hit up Nick. Hit up Carl. Hit up Luke. and we'll try to address your questions and concerns on the show as often as we can. Don't forget to subscribe, y'all. We'll talk to you soon.
Mile High Huddle.